All right, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce our next speaker. Dr. Schmidt is a distinguished research professor and a director of the Anxiety and Behavioral Health Clinic at Florida State University. He will be presenting research on an experimental examination of dangerous firearm-related behaviors. Dr. Schmidt, you may begin.
Thank you, Angela. Hello, everyone out there in Hop-In land. I'm excited to be here. Very important and interesting meeting, and I'm really pleased to be part of this. I want to just give you a bit of an overview of what I want to do with my presentation today. I want to talk about probably a different method for studying gun violence than many of the other presentations that you've seen today. And part of that is really a discussion of a paradigm that we've developed in our lab for using laboratory methods for potentially getting a better understanding of gun violence. We have some preliminary data, and I'm going to present some data from one of the 3 experiments that we're running today, and it has some actually sort of interesting and sort of intriguing findings. One thing I want to say is, as you see here, my email is available if you have any questions for me after the presentation. I see Mike is on chat. Once I get into the presentation, because of my screens, I'm not able to see the chat. So I hope to leave some time at the end for questions, but if I run out of time, obviously feel free to email me. Okay, so let's get going here. Okay, first off, I want to really acknowledge and thank the New Jersey Gun Violence Research Center. This is a super forward-thinking, important national resource, and I'm really so grateful that they were able to provide us with funding to do the work that we've started doing. Also, I want to recognize Thomas Joyner and Greg Hychek, who are co-investigators on this project. Okay, in terms of background, I'm not going to talk too much about this because you've heard this and you know about the statistics. The thing that I want to focus on here is this question of how do we better understand gun violence. And I think an important perspective to consider here is that almost all the work that's been done in this area is based on epidemiologic types of studies. And of course, during COVID, we've become very familiar with epidemiology. We've all come to appreciate the importance of epidemiology, and these kinds of studies are super important. But just like with the pandemic, epidemiology can't really answer all of the important questions. So, for example, at the most sort of basic level, epidemiologic studies typically can't test for causal relationships between variables. So I want to begin to talk a little bit about our perspective and maybe a different way of thinking about this. What we're going to argue for is that we need experimental studies and experimental study designs that are going to allow us to test ideas about causal factors that might contribute to gun violence. One of the nice things about laboratory-based designs is they will allow you to better control for lots of different factors, as well as to investigate individual as well as combined influences of a wide variety of variables, including, for example, the emotional state of an individual and their decision making at the time when they're exposed to a stressful situation. So with respect to gun violence, experimental designs offer a complementary and up until now virtually absent way of potentially providing a clearer picture of factors that might influence decisions about the use of guns. So how do we do experiments on gun violence? Certainly it's difficult or potentially impossible and ethically problematic in the real world. So if we think about developing a laboratory paradigm, one of the requirements to consider is that you really want something that is as realistic as possible. You want something that can mimic the real world as best as possible, because obviously this is a laboratory environment. But also you want something that's going to induce a fair amount of stress and a fair amount of complexity to the participant, again, to sort of mimic real world situations. When I began sort of looking at different paradigms, the typical virtual reality paradigms, as well as computer simulations, were by and large very game-like and not particularly sort of stress-inducing. Some VR paradigms are very immersive, but they didn't really do a good job of simulating the real-world environment. So our laboratory has turned to using a firearm training simulator that was developed by a company called Virtra. This company and this simulator is primarily used to train police and sometimes military personnel. The simulator provides really nice opportunities to work in a variety of different ways. You can assess sort of dynamic shooting accuracy and things like that. But the more interesting or intriguing element for our purposes is that it can provide very sort of stressful and complex and potentially sort of threatening situations where you can study judgment and behavior in terms of the use of deadly force. So in our research paradigms, participants are essentially put into these stressful simulations, and we can see how they respond to those situations when they have access to a Glock replica pistol. I have a couple quick videos just to sort of demonstrate the capabilities of the paradigm. I'll just play this real quick for you. This particular paradigm is just for sort of target shooting, if you want to familiarize people with the weapons that are used or to test their accuracy or things like that. This next brief video, is an example of one of the simulations that one could use. And what you see here lit up is a laptop computer that an operator can utilize. Many of these simulations have sort of a complex sort of a pathway or set of pathways that can be utilized by the experimenter to design more or less ambiguous or threatening situations. And so you'll see the operator sort of controlling that in this
I'm sorry to bother you,
simulation.
but I was wondering if we could spare some cash. Oh, come on, I just need a little help right now, okay? Just whatever you have. Whatever you have. Don't make this difficult, okay? Do not make this difficult. I need a little help right now, okay? Hurry up, come on, give me what you got. Give me something.
Okay. There you go. So I think you have a good sense of sort of how the simulations are set up. We use sort of a darkened room, and the sound is actually fairly loud. Some of the simulations are extremely stressful, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But one of the ways that we can make some of the situations even more stressful is through the use of what they call a threat fire device. In some cases, you can ask a participant to wear this, which delivers an electric shock that's approximately a third of the strength of a taser. And this can be essentially used to sort of raise the threat value or stress value of paradigms. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about the current study. We really have a series of 3 experiments that we're running, and I'll describe briefly, how each of these studies works and the factors that we're trying to examine. But broadly speaking, the 3 main factors we're evaluating are racial bias, threat bias, and sort of an anxious anticipation. And what I'm going to do is I'll give you some preliminary data on the work that we've done. So thus far, we've recruited about 70 folks, both from the community as well as the undergraduate subject pool at FSU. We did a pilot testing period, got some feedback and did some modification. And then we have right now 66 individuals that have been randomized to one of the 3 experiments. So right now, it's sort of a young sample, a fair amount of college students, 70% white, 70% female. There is a mixture of folks that are gun owners and then folks that are completely gun naive. The way the procedure generally works is we do some self-report measures, and then participants are randomly assigned to one of 3 studies. We have a racial priming study, an interpretation bias study, and this anxious anticipation study. And I'll talk a little bit more about each of these. In terms of the racial priming study, the way that this study works is folks are told, using some deception, that we're interested in evaluating memory, and they're asked to read a story and recall some of the details. The story describes sort of this heroic father who creates a foundation in the honor of his son's memory. And the manipulation in this study is that participants are randomly assigned to read the story that has either a photo of a white father and son or a black father and son. Okay, so that's a very simple manipulation, with the idea being that this racial priming may impact the shooting variables that I'll describe in a little bit. The anxious anticipation study is one that involves the threat fire device I described a little earlier, where some individuals are exposed to shock and they receive a series of shocks, whereas other participants don't receive any shock prior to going into the scenarios. And then our third study is our interpretation bias modification study. This particular study is sort of evolves out of a fairly robust literature suggesting that in a fairly brief manner, you can change bias in individuals by providing them with essentially a reward paradigm based on sort of how they respond to various stimuli. We've used this type of modification paradigm in other types of studies, and it clearly demonstrates some nice effects in terms of reducing, in this case, threat bias. So the way the paradigm works is that participants are shown a series of ambiguous sentences, like tapping on the window, and then they're given a probe and they're asked to interpret whether the initial stimulus is related to the probe. So in this case, they might be given as their probe, someone's trying to break in, which is a threatening interpretation of this ambiguous stimulus. If they are in our conditioning condition and they say, yes, these two things are related, then they're basically given feedback that this is an incorrect response. On the other hand, if they're given this probe, it's a tree branch moving against the wind, which would be a neutral, non-threatening stimulus, and they choose that option, they're told that that's a correct response. So it's so they basically go through a series of these kinds of things for about 10 or 15 minutes, where they're just asking to pair up these things and they're given feedback. In our active condition, we're basically giving them positive feedback anytime they choose the neutral interpretation, and then they get negative feedback anytime they choose the threatening condition. In our sham control condition, they basically get randomly positively given random positive feedback regardless of what their choice is. Okay, so those are the two conditions. And the data from this particular study are the ones that I'm going to describe today, because I won't really have time to talk about all three studies. All right, so let me talk a little bit about our outcome variables. There are lots of different ways that one could measure outcome in this paradigm, and I'll sort of describe for you the way that we're starting to think about doing that. So what we're interested in is, of course, how people are responding to threat and the behaviors that would be related to that. And as I said, you can think about that in lots of different ways. So what we have folks do is they begin each scenario with the Glock replica holstered on their side. And the first time they touch that firearm is one index that we think is relevant to how they're perceiving threat. The second index that we think is potentially relevant to sort of an advanced perception of threat would be whether or not participants actually point the firearm at the screen. And then finally, of course, if they actually fire the weapon or the replica at the screen, that would be a notable outcome. So I'm going to show you data that looks at each of these. So let's talk about the results from this first study for the interpretation bias modification study. So as of now, about 20 participants have been randomized to this particular experiment, and you see that they're fairly evenly distributed between our two conditions. We had to throw out data from 3 participants. 2 participants discontinued, and right now, close to 10% of participants have been discontinuing our experiments because they were essentially too stressed out during the paradigm. So the paradigms themselves involve a lot of screaming. Sometimes there are children or even infants involved. They're designed to be, very stressful, and for some participants, it's just too much, and they decide that they don't want any part of it. And so, on the one hand, it's less than ideal that people are dropping out. On the other, it's really evidence to us that we have designed a fairly stress-inducing set of experimental paradigms for folks. We also have sort of a subgroup of individuals that discontinue because they just don't want to be part of it, and they sort of tell us early on that they don't want to be studied in terms of guns, and they take issue with it. And in this particular study, we threw out one person so far because they just did not want to do anything. So they would just stand there and not sort of touch the gun at all and not look at the screen and that kind of thing. So we're dealing with those kinds of issues as well. Preliminarily looking at differences across the two conditions, we're not seeing differences in race, sex, gun ownership, and lots of other variables, political affiliation. So in general, these folks are distributed evenly. Okay, so let's look at a little bit of data. So this is the first sort of outcome variable that I described earlier in terms of latency to touch the Glock. And here we're seeing that those that receive our active condition, as we would sort of hypothesize, if you're sort of reducing their sort of threat bias, we're seeing sort of a substantial delay in terms of how quickly they're reacting to a potentially ambiguously threatening situation. Similarly, we're seeing the same pattern in terms of actually pointing the firearm. There's that latency. We are not seeing a latency in terms of actually firing the firearm, and I'll show you some detail about that. Okay, those are the three variables. Here we're seeing, here are the 8 different paradigms that we're using, and we see overall the differences are about 20% in terms of touching the firearm across the different paradigms. So it's a fairly consistent effect across all these various paradigms. The one scenario we're seeing a more dramatic difference, but overall we're seeing a fairly nice, robust 20% difference in terms of the first sort of outcome variable. These are the latencies in terms of pointing, and once again, it's a fairly consistent pattern across all the scenarios. There's one significant difference at this point. Overall, we're talking about 70% in our sham condition versus 83% prior to pointing. So, about a 15% difference there. And this is the percentage of participants that are actually firing the firearm across condition. And this is where things are not as clean as one might like. These first 2 scenarios, and I should say the scenarios are counterbalanced, so we don't always present them in the same order to all participants. But in these 2 scenarios, we are seeing sort of the effect that we would anticipate in terms of somewhat of a diminished percentage that are firing. We have another scenario where we're seeing a fairly robust difference in the opposite direction. We're going to need to look at some of these scenarios to ascertain what might be going on if these turn out to be reliable effects. I should also say there are 2 scenarios where no one has shot at the screen, and that's actually appropriate because both of those are ambiguous and non-threatening. And so again, we are seeing some patterns that we might expect, some that we're not expecting in terms of actually firing of the Glock replica. So let's think about some other factors that we can start to look at in the context of this paradigm. We've just looked, for the purposes of this meeting, we've looked at some different things for some main effects and interactions. We're not seeing main effects for sort of attitudes about gun control. We're not seeing effects for political affiliation and some other variables, but we are getting some effects. So here we see probably an anticipated effect. It's a main effect for sex. And we're seeing that across the board, males are much more likely to actually discharge the Glock replica than females. So it's almost twice the rate that men are firing across the various scenarios. We're also seeing an effect for gun ownership. So as you might anticipate, gun owners are more likely to fire the firearm relative to gun naive individuals. This is a measure of gun attitudes, and it's essentially a measure of self-efficacy in terms of guns. And so it sort of goes along with gun ownership, but we're seeing some effects for, if you feel like you have good efficacy with a gun, you're more likely to utilize it across the board in terms of these scenarios. And here we're actually seeing an interesting interaction effect with race. So with our white individuals versus our non-white individuals, we are seeing an interaction effect. This is our control condition, so our sham condition. And here we're seeing a much higher rate of white participants using the firearm. In terms of our threat reduction condition, we see that now there's sort of a non-significant effect across white and non-white individuals, which is, potentially suggestive that, white participants that receive this brief intervention and have sort of a threat bias reduction might be less, likely or less prone to use the firearm. So an intriguing, obviously preliminary study. So just, I know I have just about 5 minutes or so, but just to wrap up with a couple sort of thoughts about take-home messages for where we're at thus far. First, I think that what we have is promising, but I also want to advocate for more experimental study in the area of gun violence. As I mentioned at the beginning, it's a very complex topic, and experimental studies might offer a way to tease apart some of the complexity that's going on here with more rigorous, highly controlled laboratory-based studies. Also, as I mentioned earlier, the shooting simulator paradigm appears to be viable as a fairly intense stressor. We are having some issues with participants refusing to participate and people dropping out, but I think by and large, I'm actually sort of pleased with sort of the level of stress that we're able to engender with this particular paradigm. In terms of the findings, obviously these are fairly preliminary, and I've only reported on one of our 3 studies, but we are seeing that fairly brief manipulations can impact and potentially change behaviors that are relevant to our understanding of who decision making regarding sort of firearm use. There's of course many limitations for this work, but I think that this is a very promising start in terms of experimentally manipulating variables that are relevant to our understanding of gun violence. So I have a couple minutes. Let's see if there are questions here. Okay, so first question about IRB. So we, the IRB has been okay with some of the participants that decided to drop out. Interestingly, all of the participants that have dropped out thus far have been our community participants. The students, by and large, have been okay with this, but we have had to do essentially adverse event reporting for these incidences where students participants were actually fairly upset. So thus far, it has been a challenge, and we sort of need to balance out how sort of stressful we want this to be versus we don't want this to obviously have any kind of lasting effects on the individuals. All right, so Mike asks, are there situations that weren't available in the shooting simulator that you think would have been helpful in terms of creating ambiguous interpersonal situations where a person might have felt compelled to reach for and fire the firearm? That's a really good question, Mike. So we are not bound to the simulations that Virtra has created. That is, the program is flexible enough where you can create your own simulations, and that actually would be ideal. But to be able to do that, to videotape and create simulations that we think would be ideal is sort of cost prohibitive at this point. But at some point in the future, with better funding, I think we could create simulations where we can really do exactly what we want to do in terms of introducing ambiguity and controlling for variables within the simulators. Okay. Is there any control for whether participants are cognizant of use of force statutes in Florida? Yeah, so that's a great question. So we do some preliminary training in this particular study. We don't spend lots of time talking about this, but we do essentially outline Florida statutes in terms of appropriate use of force. So people are informed about that at the beginning. It's likely that gun owners, that percentage of our participants, are more familiar with those statutes than the gun naive individuals, but we do spend a little bit of time informing them about those statutes at the beginning. Very good questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Schmidt. I think we're now at the end of your session. I welcome everybody to go to the next session. And thank you again. Please feel free to reach out to Dr. Schmidt via his email.
Yep. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.